Grandma reveals. She had 2 husbands and neither knew for years. For decades, she led a double life without raising suspicions between the two. But everything came to light in an explosive way, in the worst possible place, a crowded hospital. What? Seemed like just a confession turned into a life lesson about consequences, courage, and new beginnings. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We'll continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The sunlight gently streamed through the window of Eleanor Fields' small apartment. At 85, her face marked by time still maintained a serene beauty, even with tired eyes that seemed to carry the weight of decades of untold stories. Her hands, with protruding veins and age spots, struggled to adjust the cell phone on the makeshift support of books on the dining table. "Is it recording, Madison?" she asked her granddaughter, who was helping with the technology. "Yes, Grandma. You can start whenever you're ready," replied the 23-year-old, adjusting the framing one last time. Eleanor took a deep breath. This would be the first of 5 videos, 5 confessions, 5 parts of a story she had kept for decades, shared only in fragments with very close people. Now inspired by a documentary about elderly people sharing their experiences on the internet, she decided it was time to leave her own record. "My name is Eleanor Fields. I'm 85 years old, and today I want to share with you the biggest mistake of my life." Her voice came out firmer than she expected. The words she had mentally rehearsed for weeks finally came to life. "I'm not here seeking forgiveness or applause. I just want to leave an honest record about the consequences of thoughtless choices. Perhaps my story can serve as a warning to someone." Eleanor paused, adjusted her delicate framed glasses, and continued, now with a slightly choked voice. "In 1957, I was only 18 when I left Fairview, in upstate New York, heading to the big city. My head was full of dreams and my heart restless. I wanted independence, a life of my own, a future different from that of the women in my family. The images of that day came to her mind with surprising clarity. The light blue dress she wore, the worn leather suitcase that had belonged to her father, the smell of the train station, the fear mixed with excitement as she watched her hometown fade away through the train window. I got a simple job at a fabric store on Canal Street. The salary was low, but enough to rent a room in a boarding house for single girls in Brooklyn. I remember Mrs. Lucy, the owner, a strict Portuguese woman who didn't allow male visitors and required us to be home by 10 at night. Eleanor smiled at the memory. Those first months in New York were challenging, but she felt alive, in control of her destiny for the first time. It was in that store that I met Robert. He was a representative for a thread and button factory, and he visited the establishment regularly, a reserved, gentle, hard-working man, different from the impetuous young men I knew from my hometown. The image of Robert formed in her mind. Tall, thin, always impeccably dressed in dark suits, even in the intense heat of New York. Black hair combed back with brilliantine, and a contained smile that rarely showed his teeth. After 6 months of timid meetings in cafes near the store, always under the watchful eye of some colleague, Robert asked me to marry him. I accepted without hesitation. It seemed like the natural path, the fulfillment of the dream of establishing myself in the big city. Eleanor paused to take a sip of water. She briefly looked at her granddaughter, who encouraged her with a nod to continue. We married in a simple ceremony, attended only by some colleagues from work and his parents, since my family couldn't afford to travel from upstate. We moved to a small apartment in Chinatown. Robert traveled a lot for work, traveling throughout New York State and neighboring states to sell the factory's products. Eleanor's voice got lower, as if she were sharing a secret. His trips gradually created a silence between us, gave void that I didn't know how to fill. When he was home, we talked about practical matters, bills, neighbors, radio news, rarely about dreams, fears, desires. It was a respectful but distant marriage. Eleanor sighed deeply, her gaze momentarily lost on an invisible point beyond the camera. After 2 years of marriage, I received a telegram informing me that my mother had fallen seriously ill. I immediately returned to my hometown. Robert, on a trip to the Rochester area, said he would meet me as soon as possible. The mention of her mother's illness brought up old emotions, still painful after so many decades. That visit, marked by homesickness and concern, completely transformed my life. At the town pharmacy, while buying medications, I ran into Anthony, my teenage boyfriend. Eleanor's face momentarily lit up with the memory. Anthony, with his tousled brown hair, intense green eyes and broad smile, represented everything she had left behind: youth, carefree passion, the feeling of belonging. Anthony was exactly as I remembered him. He now worked as the manager of his father's store and had just built a house on the family property. He asked about my life in the city, if I was happy, if I had achieved my dreams. Eleanor made a significant pause, her eyes watering. And then I made the first of many mistakes. Embarrassed, I hesitated to reveal my marriage, a hesitation that turned into omission and then into deliberate lie. I just wanted to relive for a few days what I believed I had lost. The confession came out with difficulty, as if it still weighed on her conscience. Before I knew it, I was immersed in a farce. Anthony was courting me again, and I allowed it. I kept my wedding ring in my purse. I invented a single life. In New York. I said I worked in a large department store, that I shared an apartment with friends, that I would return to my hometown when my mother got better. Eleanor looked directly at the camera, her expression now laden with solemn seriousness. What should have been just a lie of a few days turned into something much bigger. When my mother showed improvement and I returned to New York, Anthony and I had already rekindled our relationship. We promised to write letters, stay in touch. He talked about marriage, about bringing me back to our hometown. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I returned to Robert without mentioning Anthony. I returned to my marriage as if nothing had happened, but something had changed inside me. I began to live a double life. The room was silent for a few moments, only the soft hum of the fan in the corner breaking the silence. Anthony's letters arrived at the house of an old neighbor in New York who believed she was helping a forbidden but legitimate romance. Robert continued traveling, and I took advantage of his absences to respond to Anthony's passionate letters. Over time, I established a rhythm. 1 month in New York as Robert's wife, 2 weeks in my hometown as Anthony's future bride. Eleanor took a deep breath as if gathering strength to continue. I adapted rings, made up excuses, manipulated calendars. I told Robert I needed to visit my convalescent mother frequently. I told Anthony my job in the city required dedication, but that soon we could be together permanently. Her eyes again met those of her granddaughter behind the camera, seeking some judgment, but finding only attention. For 6 years I maintained this elaborate farce. 6 years living 2 versions of the same life. One as a dedicated wife in the city, another as a faithful fiancé in my hometown. The more I lied, the harder it became to turn back. Each attempt to clarify seemed to threaten the fragile structure I had created, and deep down, I was afraid of losing both worlds. Eleanor gestured to Madison, indicating that she needed a break. The image froze and the first part of her confession ended, leaving in the air the tension of a farce about to collapse. "Can we continue, Grandma?" asked Madison, adjusting the camera again after a brief pause for Eleanor to drink water and rest. The elderly woman nodded, settling better in her chair. The second video would start now, continuing the confession she had kept for decades. The double game I maintained had devastating effects, although at first I didn't fully realize. "Kid," Eleanor resumed, her voice now firmer. "The emotional distance between me and Robert grew every day. Even in the moments when we were together in the routine of our New York apartment, I felt absent, thinking about Anthony's letters hidden in the bottom of the sock drawer." Eleanor adjusted the shawl over her shoulders, as if feeling a sudden chill despite the afternoon heat. Robert wasn't a man of many words, but he began to ask questions about my increasingly frequent visits to my hometown. "Isn't your mother getting better?" he would ask. "Do you really need to go again this month?" And I would fabricate new stories, crises in my mother's health, relatives' birthdays, problems with the family house that only I could solve. The weight of the lies seemed to materialize in her tired expression. I clearly remember one night, in the summer of 1961, Robert returned earlier than expected from a trip and found me packing my suitcase for another visit to my hometown. He sat on the edge of the bed and silently watched as I nervously folded some clothes. Eleanor briefly closed her eyes, as if reliving the scene. "Eleanor," he finally said, "you seem happier when you come back from these visits, and then, gradually you become sad again, as if your place isn't here." I was paralyzed, not knowing what to answer. He continued, "Sometimes I think you have another life there, one that makes you happier than the one we built here." Eleanor's voice faltered slightly. It was the first time I felt that he suspected, not specifically of another man, but of another life. And the worst part is that he was right. I denied it, of course. I cried, invented that I missed my family, that life in the big city was harder than I expected. He hugged me, apologized for not being more present. He promised to reduce his trips, take me to the movies, walk in Central Park on Sundays. Eleanor paused, her eyes fixed on an invisible point beyond the camera. It was one of the hardest nights of my life, because for the first time I clearly saw the pain I was causing to a good man who trusted me. And yet, the next morning, I took the train to my hometown, to Anthony's arms. Her wrinkled face now showed a mixture of shame and regret. In my hometown, things were also starting to get complicated. My older brother, August, always rigid and critical, began to question my behavior during visits. "Why do you never bring your boss to meet the family?" he would ask, referring to the lie I had told about working for a store manager who didn't allow me regular time off. Eleanor moved her hands uncomfortably in her lap. August noticed inconsistencies in my stories. Why did I wear a thin gold wedding band when I arrived from New York, but changed it for a silver ring with a small blue stone, a gift from Anthony, when I was in town? Why did I receive letters from New York in different envelopes with different handwriting? Why did I get so nervous when someone mentioned a visit to the city? The afternoon light coming through the window was beginning to diminish, casting soft shadows on Eleanor's wrinkled face. Anthony was also pushing for decisions. After 4 years of our secret engagement, as he called it, he wanted to make everything official, set the wedding date, start building the house where we would live. "Why wait longer?" he questioned. "Your mother is better now. You can quit that job that ties you so much to the city." Eleanor sighed deeply, and I created more excuses. I said I needed to save more money, that I had responsibilities to colleagues at the store, that I couldn't abandon my life in New York all at once. The truth is that I couldn't choose, or perhaps more honestly, I didn't want to choose. There was comfort in life with Robert, stability, respect, and there was passion with Anthony, youth, the feeling of returning to my roots. The elderly woman adjusted her glasses, her gaze now more direct to the camera. In 1963, my mother's health really deteriorated. It was no longer an excuse, but a painful reality. The doctors diagnosed a serious heart problem. I had to go more frequently to my hometown, and this generated even more tension with Robert. Eleanor took another sip of water before continuing. During one of these visits, I realized that I could no longer postpone the inevitable. My mother, from her hospital bed, held my hand and said, "Daughter, your fiancé Anthony has come to visit me every day. How good that you finally found a good man to marry." My heart froze. She didn't know about my marriage in New York. No one in the family knew. And now Anthony was fully integrated into the family, bringing gifts, financially helping with hospital costs. Her face showed the anguish of that moment, even after so many decades. That night, sitting alone on the porch of my childhood home, I made a decision that would change everything. I would tell Anthony the truth. I would explain about Robert, ask for forgiveness, end our relationship. It was the right thing to do. I had deceived everyone for too long. Eleanor briefly looked at her granddaughter, who encouraged her with a gentle nod to continue. I arranged to meet Anthony the next day, on a bench in the central square. I mentally rehearsed what I would say, how I would explain, but when I got there, he was radiant, holding a small blue velvet box. Before I could speak, he knelt down and opened the box, revealing a ring with a larger stone than the first one he had given me. Eleanor's voice choked up. "Eleanor," he said, "I can't wait any longer. I want us to get married next month. I've already spoken to the pastor, reserved the church. Your mother deserves to see her daughter married before—" And he didn't complete the sentence, but I understood what he meant. I was paralyzed, without reaction. And then I made another terrible mistake. I accepted the proposal. Eleanor took a deep breath as if air was failing her. I returned to New York the next day, devastated by my own cowardice. Robert was waiting for me at the station, something he rarely did. He brought flowers and a small package. 6 years of marriage, he said with a shy smile. "I know our anniversary was last week and I was traveling, but I wanted to celebrate with you." Inside the package, a delicate wristwatch that he had saved months to buy. Silent tears began to stream down Eleanor's wrinkled face. That night, I couldn't sleep. Sitting in the dark living room of our small apartment, I contemplated the 2 wedding rings I carried, the official one on my finger and Anthony's hidden in my purse. I thought about the families I was deceiving, the lives I was manipulating with my lies. I decided that I would tell Robert everything the next morning, before the situation got even worse. Eleanor wiped away the tears with a handkerchief her granddaughter offered her. But the morning brought news that postponed my confession. The hospital in my hometown called. My mother was in critical condition. Robert insisted on accompanying me this time. "You shouldn't face this alone," he said, quickly preparing a small suitcase. "I've already notified the factory that I need a few days off." Eleanor closed her eyes as if wanting to block the memory. I tried to dissuade him in every way. I said it would be a tiring trip, that the accommodation at the family house was precarious, that he didn't know anyone in the town. But Robert was firm. "I am your husband, Eleanor. It's past time I met your family." The tension was palpable, in her account even after so many decades. The train journey was a torment. With each station that brought us closer to my hometown, I felt like I was walking to my own end. Robert beside me held my hand and attributed my nervousness to concern for my mother. If only he knew. Eleanor paused, taking a deep breath. We arrived at the hospital in the early afternoon. My mother was in the ICU, and only close family members could enter, one at a time. Robert stayed in the waiting room while I went in. In the hallway I met my brothers, cousins, aunts, and Anthony. The tension in Eleanor's face intensified. Anthony came in my direction, arms open for a hug. "My love," he said loudly, "you—" finally arrived. He had hardly finished the phrase when he saw Robert approaching behind me, politely extending his hand to greet my wife's family as he introduced himself. Eleanor covered her face with her hands for a moment, as if she could hide from that memory. Time seemed to freeze. I saw Anthony's smile transform into confusion, then understanding, and finally, a silent fury. I saw Robert's face pass from cordiality to suspicion, to disbelief. I saw my brothers exchange glances, suddenly understanding the inconsistencies they had noticed over the years. Eleanor looked directly at the camera, her eyes now dry and firm. It was the total collapse of my farce. There, in a hospital corridor in front of family, medical staff, and acquaintances from the town, my double life was exposed in the rawest possible way. Anthony found out I had been married for 6 years. Robert found out that throughout our marriage, I maintained another relationship. My brothers found out that behind the frequent visits was a network of lies. Eleanor gestured to her granddaughter, indicating that she needed another break. The image froze, the second chapter of her story ending at the exact moment her world collapsed like a house of cards. After a brief rest, Eleanor adjusted herself again in front of the camera for the 3rd video in her series of confessions. Madison noticed that her grandmother seemed more exhausted, as if reliving those memories consumed her physical energy. "Grandma, we can continue another day if you prefer," suggested the young woman. "No, dear," replied Eleanor with determination. "I need to finish what I started. It's like removing a weight I've carried for decades." The camera started recording again, and Eleanor resumed her narrative at the exact point where she had stopped. What followed that moment in the hospital was chaos, she said, her voice now lower. Anthony turned and left without saying a word. Robert Pale asked if we could talk in private. My brothers, especially August, looked at me with a mixture of shock and contempt. Eleanor took a deep breath before continuing. Robert and I went to the hospital garden. We sat on a secluded bench under a tree. For several minutes we were silent. Finally, he spoke. "Why, Eleanor? Why maintain this lie for so long? Why marry me if you loved another man?" The wrinkles around Eleanor's eyes seemed deeper as she recalled. I tried to explain, but how do you justify the unjustifiable? I talked about the loneliness during his trips, about the connection with my roots, about the fear of losing what we had built. Everything sounded like empty excuses, and they were. Deep down it was pure cowardice and selfishness. Eleanor briefly looked at her granddaughter, as if seeking judgment in her eyes, but found only understanding. Robert listened in silence. When I finished, he simply said, "I'm going back to New York tonight. I don't want to see you anymore." He gave me some money and added, "Your things will be at the building's reception by the end of the week." The elderly woman paused, her eyes fixed on a distant point, as if she could see that scene again before her. I stayed there, paralyzed, watching my husband walk away through the hospital garden. He, who had always been so controlled in his emotions, now walked with hunched shoulders, as if carrying an invisible weight. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. I returned to the hospital, but I didn't have the courage to face my brothers. August had taken control of the situation and informed, without looking directly at me, that I was no longer welcome in the family home. "You have brought enough shame to all of us," he said. The pain of those words still seemed fresh, even after so many decades. I spent the night on a hospital bench. The next morning, when I went to see my mother, the nurse informed me that the family had left specific instructions not to allow my entry. "Your brother said your presence would only worsen her condition," she explained, embarrassed. Eleanor wiped away a solitary tear. I tried to find Anthony. I went to his house, to his father's store, to the places we used to frequent, but he had disappeared. I later found out that he had asked for a few days off and traveled to relatives in another state. The afternoon light came through the window, creating a golden halo around Eleanor's fragile figure. I found myself completely alone, without a home, without income, without anyone. I had only the clothes on my back, a small bag with few belongings, and the money Robert had given me. I tried to return to New York, but when I arrived at our apartment, the doorman confirmed that Robert had already collected my things. "They're all here," he said, showing 2 suitcases in the storage room. Eleanor paused, taking a sip of water. I wasn't accepted back at my old job. The news about my double life had already reached there through a colleague of Robert's. "We can't have someone without character serving our customers," said the manager. Her face showed the humiliation of those days. "For almost 2 weeks I lived like a nomad. I slept in cheap boarding houses when money allowed, or on park benches when it didn't. I ate as little as possible to save money. I came to think that I would never find a place in the world again, that perhaps it would be better to simply disappear." Eleanor looked directly at the camera, her eyes now dry and determined. "It was then that I met Mrs. Celeste. I was sitting in front of a church in Little Italy, exhausted and hungry, when this elderly lady approached and offered me a plate of food. 'You look like you need help, my child,' she simply said. A soft smile illuminated Eleanor's wrinkled face. Mrs. Celeste was about 70 at the time. A widow, she lived alone in a small apartment near the church. When she found out I had nowhere to go, she offered me temporary shelter. 'Until you find a path,' were her words. Eleanor adjusted the shawl over her shoulders. Mrs. Celeste's gesture turned into much more than temporary shelter. I received a small room at the back of the apartment and a modest job. Take care of the house and help with daily tasks that were already difficult for her due to her age. Gratitude was evident in every word from Eleanor. During the first months, I said nothing about my past. I was ashamed, afraid of being judged and expelled again, but Mrs. Celeste never pressed. "We all have stories we prefer not to tell," she would say. "What matters is what we do from now on." Eleanor smiled with the memory. Over time, I gained confidence. On a winter night, as we were having tea in the small living room, I told Mrs. Celeste everything. Leaving my hometown, my marriage to Robert, the reunion with Anthony, the double life, the discovery, the abandonment, Eleanor's expression softened. I expected to see judgment in her eyes, but I found only understanding. "My child," she said after a long silence, "we all make mistakes, some bigger, some smaller. What defines our character is not the mistake itself, but what we do after it." Eleanor seemed lighter sharing this memory. Mrs. Celeste also carried her stories, her mistakes. Over time, she told me about her only son who hadn't spoken to her for decades due to a disagreement over her husband's inheritance, about the brother whom she had denied help at a crucial moment. We shared the silence of the mornings and the laments of the night. Between us was born a friendship based on truth and mutual respect. Eleanor's granddaughter smiled behind the camera, clearly moved by her grandmother's story. It was Charles, Mrs. Celeste's son, who indirectly changed the course of my life again. After years without contact, he reappeared for a brief visit. He was a lawyer in Rochester, and noticing my interest in sewing, I always mended and adapted clothes for Mrs. Celeste and myself, suggested that I enroll in a night course. Eleanor visibly animated as she recalled this moment. "You have talent," he said, when he saw a dress I had transformed from scraps. "With proper training, you could work in sewing ateliers or even open your own business." Mrs. Celeste immediately supported the idea and offered to pay for the course. Gratitude shone in Eleanor's eyes. I enrolled in the St. Clara Vocational School in the city centre. Classes were 3 times a week, from 7 to 10 at night. I remember the nervousness of the first day, the insecurity of being among younger people, the fear of not being able to keep up. Eleanor smiled at the memory. But I discovered that I really had a natural talent for sewing. My hands, which for years had manipulated fabrics in the store where I worked, now created pieces that impressed even the most demanding teachers. Her face assumed a more serious expression. However, not everything was easy. After a few months, I faced resistance and malicious comments when some colleagues discovered my past. One of them was a distant cousin of a friend of Robert's, and soon the story of the woman who kept 2 husbands spread throughout the school. Eleanor took a deep breath before continuing. "I was called a traitor, a liar, a woman without honor. I found my notebook torn, heard whispers when I entered the room, saw looks of contempt. I thought about giving up, about returning to the safe anonymity of Mrs. Celeste's apartment." Her expression hardened with determination. But something had changed in me. I decided that I would no longer retreat, that I would face the consequences of my actions without running away, that I would build a new life based on truth, even if painful. A smile of pride illuminated her wrinkled face. I continued attending classes, ignoring the comments, focusing only on learning. Gradually, talent spoke louder than scandal. My pieces began to be noticed, praised. The head teacher, Mrs. Amelia, became my defender. "I don't care what they say about you," she declared one day in front of the class. "What I see is a dedicated and talented student." Eleanor adjusted her glasses, her eyes shining with the memory. I graduated with honors, presenting a collection of dresses inspired by New York architecture. Mrs. Celeste was in the front row of the final presentation, applauding with tears in her eyes. It was one of the happiest moments of my life. A deep sigh escaped Eleanor's lips. In the following years, I worked in 2 different ateliers, saving every penny. Mrs. Celeste insisted that I didn't need to pay rent, but I made a point of contributing to household expenses. Our relationship evolved from landlady and tenant to a true partnership. We were like mother and daughter, filling voids in each other's lives. Eleanor's voice choked up slightly. In 1972, after almost 5 years living with Mrs. Celeste, I managed to open my own atelier. It was a tiny space, actually just an adapted room at the back of a commercial gallery in Brooklyn. But it was mine. I called it Rebirth Atelier, a name that reflected my own journey. Genuine pride was evident in her voice. The first months were difficult. I had few clients, almost all referred by Mrs. Celeste and her acquaintances from church. But gradually my work began to be recognized. I specialized in recovering and transforming old pieces, giving new life to wedding dresses kept for decades, curtains that became elegant outfits, quilts that transformed into coats. Eleanor paused as if organizing her thoughts. It was at this time that I began to teach sewing to young women in vulnerable situations. It all started when a lady from the church brought her niece who had fled from an abusive relationship and needed work. I taught her the basics of sewing, and soon she became my assistant. A smile illuminated Eleanor's face. I realized then that by helping other women to get back on their feet, I also found new layers of healing within myself. Each story of overcoming that I witnessed was like a mirror of my own journey. Each refurbished dress, each transformed piece symbolized the possibility of a new beginning. Eleanor looked at her granddaughter, who encouraged her with a nod to continue. In 1975, Mrs. Celeste, who was already 82 years old, began to show signs of fragility. Her memory failed, her legs no longer supported her firmly. Gradually, our roles reversed. Now I was the one taking care of her. Eleanor's face showed the pain of that period. For almost 2 years, I divided myself between the atelier and caring for Mrs. Celeste. I hired a nurse for the periods when I needed to go out, but I made a point of being present at meals, of reading to her at night, of combing her hair every morning as she liked. Eleanor took a deep breath, emotional. On a June morning in 1977, Mrs. Celeste passed away in her sleep. Silently, peacefully, I found her with a serene expression, as if she had finally found peace. Silent tears ran down Eleanor's wrinkled face. The emptiness I felt was immense. I lost not only a friend, a mentor, but the only person who knew my entire story and still loved me unconditionally. Eleanor wiped away the tears with the handkerchief. 2 weeks after saying goodbye to Mrs. Celeste, I received a visit from Charles, her son. He brought the will. To my surprise, Mrs. Celeste had left me part of the sale of the apartment. She wanted you to have a complete fresh start, explained Charles, free from the past, free from the painful memories of this place. Let's move on to the last chapter of my story, said Eleanor, adjusting herself in the chair for the 4th video of her series. Despite the visible fatigue on her face, there was also a serene determination, as if completing that account was an important mission. With the money from Mrs. Celeste's inheritance, I made a decision that surprised even myself, she continued. I decided to move to a city near my former family. Not exactly my hometown, but a neighboring one just 40 minutes away by bus. I finally wanted to make peace with my history. Eleanor took a deep breath, as if gathering strength to continue. I sold the atelier in Brooklyn and opened a new one in Riverside. I bought a small house with a space in the front that I adapted for work. I called it Rebirth again, maintaining the essence of starting over. A soft smile illuminated her wrinkled face. The change wasn't just geographical. It was a statement of intentions to myself. I would no longer run from my past. I was ready to face it, to assume the consequences of my actions without subterfuge. Eleanor briefly looked at her granddaughter before continuing. I started by writing letters, one for each brother. They weren't letters asking for forgiveness or trying to justify my actions. They were letters introducing myself, who I had become, what I had learned, how I lived now. I told them about Mrs. Celeste, about the atelier, about the young women I taught. I included my new address and phone number, making it clear that I was open to contact without expectations. Eleanor adjusted the shawl over her shoulders. Some letters were ignored, others answered with coldness, just brief confirmations. Of receipt. But my younger sister Cecilia surprised me. She responded with a 4-page letter, telling me about her life, her children, the family events in the years we had been separated, and, at the end, an invitation. "If you want, come have coffee at my house next Sunday." The emotion was evident in Eleanor's voice. I remember how I trembled as I got off the bus that Sunday morning. I was returning to the city where I grew up after almost 15 years of absence. I recognized streets, houses, the church where I had my first communion, and I felt the weight of curious looks. Some recognized me, others weren't sure. I was now a woman of almost 40, very different from the young woman who had left for the big city decades before. Eleanor took a sip of water before proceeding. The reunion with Cecilia was both exciting and difficult. She received me with a restrained hug, introduced me to her teenage children who had never known Aunt Eleanor. We talked about superficial matters during coffee, the weather, news from the city, recipes. Only when the children left could we talk about the past. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, reliving that conversation. Cecilia didn't spare words. She told how our mother suffered upon learning of my betrayal, how her health quickly deteriorated after the scandal at the hospital. How August, our older brother, practically forbade anyone from mentioning my name in the house. How Anthony sank into bitterness, refusing to consider other relationships for years. A solitary tear ran down Eleanor's wrinkled face. But Cecilia also said something that surprised me. "I always missed you, sis. I always thought the punishment was disproportionate to the error. Yes, you lied, deceived, hurt people, but you've also punished yourself enough, haven't you? And in the end, who has never made mistakes?" A trembling smile formed on Eleanor's face. That morning, coffee was the first step in a long journey of rapprochement. Cecilia invited me to her youngest son's birthday the following month. There I met other family members, cousins, aunts, 2 of my brothers. Some greeted me with reserve, others completely ignored me. But I was there, present, visible. No longer a ghost from the past, but a real person with virtues and flaws. Eleanor adjusted her glasses, her gaze directly at the camera. August, my older brother, refused to see me for years. When we finally met at an aunt's funeral, he was clear. "I will never forgive you for what you did to our mother." I didn't argue, didn't defend myself. I just nodded and replied, "I understand your feeling, but I'll be here when and if you want to talk." Eleanor paused, as if organizing her thoughts. In the following years, I participated more and more in community life, not just in the family, but in the city. I cooked for local church events, taught sewing in community efforts, offered my services for free to families who couldn't afford alterations to school uniforms or work clothes. Her face lit up with the memory. Gradually, I regained a place in the community, no longer as the one who had deceived 2 men, but as Miss Eleanor the seamstress, known for her generosity and dedication. People have short memories for others' scandals when you become part of their daily lives, when you contribute in some way to their lives. Eleanor smiled, the wrinkles around her eyes accentuating. In 1985, almost 20 years after the scandal, during a church fair, I ran into Anthony. Time had changed our faces, but not erased the immediate recognition. He was accompanied by his wife, a woman with a gentle smile and 2 teenage children. The tension was visible on Eleanor's face as she narrated. For a moment, I thought about running away, avoiding the confrontation. But I was no longer that woman who ran from problems. I approached and greeted him politely. I introduced myself to his wife as an old acquaintance. Anthony seemed surprised by my initiative, but returned the greeting with formality. Eleanor sighed deeply. Later that night, he sought me out when I was alone, organizing clothes for the square dance. We had a long and painful conversation. I talked about the exile, the sleepless nights, the shame I faced. He listened to me in silence, his expression unreadable. Eleanor wiped away a tear with the handkerchief. When I finished, Anthony revealed something that shook me. He had known about my lies before the scandal at the hospital. A friend had seen me in New York with Robert and commented about the couple who seemed so happy. Anthony preferred silence, waiting for me to confess on my own. Eleanor's voice faltered slightly. "Why didn't you confront me?" I asked. "Pride, perhaps," he replied after a long silence. "Or fear of losing what I thought I had. I also lived in guilt for not having the courage to confront you, for prolonging a situation that hurt so many people." Eleanor looked directly at the camera, her eyes moist but firm. There was no immediate forgiveness that night, but there was something equally important: truth. After decades of silence and resentment, we could finally look into each other's eyes and recognize our shared humanity, our flaws, our weaknesses. A soft smile illuminated Eleanor's face. In the following years, we occasionally crossed paths at town events. We greeted each other politely, exchanged a few words about the weather, the harvest, local news. We weren't friends, but we were no longer enemies. There was mutual respect, a silent acknowledgement that we had both moved on. Eleanor paused, taking another sip of water. As for Robert, I never saw him in person again. I learned through mutual acquaintances that he had moved to South Dakota, remarried, had children. In 1990, I received news that he had faced serious health problems and was hospitalized in Sioux Falls. Eleanor's expression became solemn. I sent flowers anonymously to the hospital, a silent gesture, no letter, no explanation, just an act of respect. It was the way I had found to close that cycle. Eleanor took a deep breath before continuing. A few months later, I learned through a newspaper that Robert had left this world. I cried alone in my room, not only for him, but for everything we had lost, for everything that could have been different if I had made other choices. Eleanor faced the camera, her eyes now dry and determined. Life went on. My atelier prospered modestly. I trained dozens of young seamstresses over the years. Some opened their own businesses, others found jobs in clothing factories, bridal shops, theaters. Seeing them gaining financial independence and self-esteem was my greatest reward. A genuine smile illuminated her face. In 1997, at 58, I received an unexpected invitation to teach sewing in the city's social assistance program. I accepted immediately. For more than 15 years, I taught the craft to women in vulnerable situations, many leaving abusive relationships, others seeking a profession after years dedicated exclusively to family. Pride was evident in her voice. I created my own methodology based not only on sewing techniques, but on reflections on self-esteem, independence, new beginnings. I used my own story, without glamorization, without victimization, as an example that it is always possible to rebuild oneself after mistakes and falls. Eleanor adjusted herself in the chair, her posture now more erect. In 2010, at 71, I received an honor from the City Council for my work with these women. It was a complete surprise when, at the ceremony, I saw August, my older brother, sitting discreetly at the back of the auditorium. He didn't come to greet me, didn't say a word, but he was there. It was his way of saying that, finally, he recognized my value. Silent tears ran down Eleanor's wrinkled face. August passed away 2 years later, without us having a formal reconciliation. But that silent presence at the honor ceremony was his gesture of peace, and I accepted it with gratitude. Eleanor took a deep breath, as if reaching the end of a long journey. The years passed. I officially retired in 2015 at 76, but continued teaching informally at home. My nephews, Cecilia's children, and those of my other brothers became an important part of my life. Gradually, I became Aunt Eleanor, the one who told stories from the past, kept secrets of the younger ones, gave advice without judgment. A smile illuminated her wrinkled face. And then, a few weeks ago, Madison, my dear niece-granddaughter, Eleanor made an affectionate gesture to the young woman behind the camera, showed me a documentary about elderly people sharing their stories on the internet. "Grandma," she said, "your story could help so many people. Have you ever thought about recording it?" Eleanor looked lovingly at her granddaughter. At first I resisted. Who would be interested in the story of an 85-year-old woman? What relevance would my mistakes and successes from decades ago have for today's young people? But Madison insisted, "Your story is about choices, consequences, New beginnings. It's timeless. Eleanor looked directly at the camera, her tired but serene eyes. And so, here I am, sharing the biggest mistake of my life and everything that came after it, not to seek absolution or applause, just to leave an honest record, an experience that might serve as both warning and hope. Eleanor paused, her gaze lost in distant memories. I'm not proud of the years of lies, of the suffering I caused to Robert, to Anthony, to my family. There is no justification for what I did, but I also don't define myself solely by those mistakes. We are more than our worst decisions, more than our moments of weakness. A deep serenity now emanated from Eleanor's wrinkled face. Today, my videos circulate among people who know me and strangers touched by my frankness. I receive messages from confused young people with their choices, from adults facing the consequences of mistakes, from elderly people seeking reconciliation with their past. Eleanor smiled, the wrinkles around her eyes accentuating. I don't deny my past, I don't try to justify it. But I walk with it, not as a prison, but as fertile soil where truth and courage germinated. My story is not about innocence, but about responsibility. Not about easy redemption, but about daily reparation. Eleanor took a deep breath, her voice now firmer. A life marked by failures, yes, but also by a constant choice not to lie anymore, not to run away anymore, not to give up on myself, to become gradually someone worth listening to. Eleanor gestured to her granddaughter, indicating that she had finished. For a few moments, there was only silence in the small room, broken only by the soft hum of the fan. Madison, Eleanor finally said, you can turn off the camera now, my story is complete. The young woman approached and hugged her grandmother affectionately. No, Grandma, your story continues every day, and now it will inspire many people. Eleanor smiled, her tired eyes shining with a renewed light. Who would have thought that at 85 I would become a digital influencer, right? Both laughed, united not only by blood, but by the deep understanding that our stories, with all their mistakes, successes, falls and new beginnings, are the greatest legacy we leave. Dear listeners, we hope that Eleanor's story has touched your hearts. To follow more moving narratives like this one, we have prepared a special playlist with equally engaging stories. Find it here, clicking on the left. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like to the video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of human life with its flaws, new beginnings, and redemptions. Don't miss our upcoming content. Share in the comments if any part of Eleanor's journey resonated with you